Moss was announced June 12th, 2017, and for that time, I wasn't actually in VR. I wasn't in VR until around 2020. I originally heard about Moss from another YouTuber named Live Open Mike who told me that this is one of his favorite games. And as a side note here, I definitely recommend checking out his channel. He has some unique perspectives on games and VR as a whole that I think are very refreshing in kind of the niche that we are in right now when it comes to creators in the space. That said, upon seeing the trailer when he sent it to me, I didn't necessarily think that this game was going to be as fulfilling as it was. That's not to say that the game didn't look like it was going to be enjoyable by any means, but it's not something that would be my first option. So imagine how surprised I was that after I've played Moss and really experienced the story, I felt like it provided me with one of the most connected characters I've ever played. I think for me personally, it has something to do with the way that Polyarc was able to present Quill as being a character that both has her own feelings, as well as doesn't communicate those by being overly direct. A lot of this comes from the body language of Quill, and that's what really sets her apart from a lot of characters in other games. On top of this, her size, just being so small, it's something that you already feel like you want to protect when it comes to these smaller characters. Obviously, there's a lot more going on in this game than just our interactions with Quill, and I thought those interactions when shown in the trailer were not going to be as meaningful as they were until I actually played the game. Being able to high-five a character that you technically control makes it feel like you didn't do all the work alone. More of a side-by-side co-op teammate without actually having that co-op feel. The connection between you and the character in front of you is just amazing, and I've never really felt like I've experienced something this close to a non-verbal character in a game that I've played. I'm Butters with an O, and I want to welcome you to my review of Moss, and hopefully by the end of it, you will understand what makes a game like this work better in VR than it does in any other gaming medium. Starting off, the game has us sitting in a library in front of a book which illuminates and invites us to interact with its story. This library does not offer much in the way of interaction, but the feeling of the high ceilings and a mix of both candle and natural light makes it feel like something out of a storybook. This is a very fitting location for the story of Moss to be told, and this book will be our guide through Quill's journey to rescue her uncle and fight to return her people to their homeland. We open the book and the narrator begins reading the history of what happened prior to the start of the game. Cinder Night was the night that both the king and their village were destroyed, all in search of a glass relic. This caused people to flee and find refuge in the forest, all while Argus and the Sprite Champion helped hold off the attack from the Arcane. Unfortunately, the Sprite Champion was injured and retreated, later dying and growing into a tree to protect the glass. After this brief introduction, we are officially introduced to Quill under this same tree. This introduction to Quill, with the lighting, the sound, the slight breeze of the forest, along with a small rustle of grass drawing our attention down to see her, is perfect. Sound and lighting play a pivotal role throughout your entire experience of Moss, and you'll see both of these elements really play off of each other in a complementary way to help the player understand where and what they should be looking at. Following Quill's interaction with the glass, she's able to see us and our character. The narrator, who is voiced by Morla Gorondona, gives a sort of exposition of what Quill is thinking and how she's feeling.
She was not exactly sure what she roused, but she felt no danger from the being silently peering down at her.
Our protagonist is not able to vocally communicate with us. However, you will see her small mannerisms and body language are able to really show that she doesn't fear us. Quill, however, can communicate using sign language. In some bigger moments of the game, that's when you'll really see this. I don't personally know sign language, but the way that Polyarc developed this game They make it easy enough to understand for those of us who don't use sign language in any way, shape, or form in our daily lives. On top of all this, Polyarc really took into account the way that a mouse moves and traverses a world. The way that Quill climbs, jumps, and swings her sword is really cute and honestly feels like something a mouse would do in our world if they were able to wield any of these weapons. How can you look at this tiny mouse doing anything and not want to offer a helping hand immediately? And you're going to hear me say this a million times throughout this review, but Polyarc just did an amazing job with really bringing this character to life. We head back to the village while solving a few puzzles and are eased into the world of Moss. We make it to the village and see how life is for the people now versus where they came from. It doesn't seem like there are any struggling people by any means, and it honestly seems like a pretty peaceful place. Visually, everything here is really amazing, kind of seeing the way that they've adopted the trees into houses and made it kind of feel like a living village, a living epicenter of life. It kind of gives that feeling of the Shire from Lord of the Rings. Making it to Quill's house, we meet her uncle Argus, who tells her that the piece of glass that she found can't mean anything good, and he wishes he could take the burden that had befallen her when she found this. He tells her not to leave the house as he goes to inform the sprites that the glass has returned.
I promise, she said reluctantly.
Once Argus leaves, Quill goes to sleep only to be woken up by a starthing. I want to interrupt here because the beauty of both the lighting along with the starthing kind of going around and then being able to see Quill's breath rapidly change all at once when the starthing hits the table is just a wonderful culmination of details, and such small details coming together to create a very believable scene. This starthing enters the house and wakes Quill up, telling her they know where her uncle went. We follow even though the narrator says that starthings bring nothing good with them. We follow them, solving more puzzles until eventually they open a portal and we enter near a wetland. This is the mire. The funny thing about VR and scale is the fact that anyone who's played VR understands that seeing scale in VR for the very first time is mind-blowing. However, I think the perspective of Moss kind of blows my mind just a little bit more. It kind of brings me back to when I first started playing VR. It's definitely one of those things that really does give you perspective, since you're kind of in between the biggest and the smallest thing living within the frame of reference that you have in Moss's world. On your way to catch your uncle, you encounter a deer within the water, and those deer are obviously going to be deer size. It's interesting to see just how small a mouse is compared to a deer that's in the background, and obviously if you decide to stand in this mainly seated game, you're going to see what your scale is like against all of them as well. This kind of adds that deeper level of immersion, and those feelings of being in this game, noticing a small creature along with a creature that you may even see every day along with yourself all in that same area, gives a much deeper sense of immersion in my eyes. These are the feelings that I live for when I try these unique type of VR games. And to add to this, I somehow felt both intrigued and dreadful at the same time. I was not fearful for myself, but for Quill, as these are much larger creatures that could unintentionally hurt her. Once we arrive and find our uncle's squirrel, there is a boat that we take across to continue our way through the mire. Arriving, Quill is left alone by the starthing and falls on some thorns. This is eventually how we learn to heal Quill, with the glass that she holds in her backpack, by picking her up and kind of putting her back on her feet. I think this is a very fitting animation for healing, kind of dusting yourself off. This is then where we get our first piece of sign language where she thanks us. And again, when you see this in game and you experience this yourself as you're going through, this gives a much deeper connection than seeing it in this review on this screen that you're watching on. As we continue to progress through the mire and make it to our first arena, this is where we meet our first arcane enemy. They only do melee damage, but can't be interrupted while they charge, so you're going to need to learn how to dodge between the combos, and if you get too greedy while trying to hit them, deciding that later you need to dodge, these animations do not cancel, so you need to make sure that you're being smart with how you are encountering and combating these melee enemies. After we finish this first arena, we meet a group of sprites and meet their leader, Veda. She seems to be the one that kind of knows everything and really makes the decision for her people. Although she does help us by giving us a new gauntlet and a sword, there are people among her that do not think we deserve to wield the glass. The previous champion of the glass was a sprite, and they feel as though their connection is much deeper than anybody else's, and that they kind of deserve to have the glass. However, Veda decides that the glass is chosen and it needs to play out the way that it is currently. Throughout our travels, we encounter puzzles that have us moving blocks, raising and lowering platforms, along with other interesting means of interaction with these problems. There's also combat within Moss, and this combat to me, depending upon the layout of that specific arena, gives me a mix between the side-scrolling and 3D boss fights of Crash Bandicoot. This kind of brought me back to when I was younger and wasn't really playing a lot of FPS games, or not as much as I am now currently, but the combat overall is really enjoyable. I'm not going to say that it was always super easy. Overall, I think combat is just as much of a puzzle as the puzzles themselves. For instance, there are 3 different enemies that you will continue to face off against, one being just melee attack, the other has a cannon that can shoot along with using melee, and then there's a third enemy that gets close to you before a timer starts and then it explodes with a gas. All of these have their own unique means, and you will be able to kind of interact with them as enemies, controlling their movements, deciding when and where they explode, or which direction they're able to shoot their cannons. A lot of these are used to interact with the puzzle and are used as pawns to help you get through some of these levels and figure out different ways to traverse each location as you travel through it. There are definitely times that I was a little confused on which joystick I was using, where I would just control Quill and accidentally make her fall off the map, making a mistake. But even then, most of the time, the mistakes of me getting an accidental death don't actually hurt me too much, because after you hit a certain step of each puzzle, usually that step does not reset and you don't have to restart the entire thing. It's really nice because this offers a point of accessibility and ease, because there is no difficulty levels. This is just like the default intended way to play. So I do think that this is nice, especially if you've had a hard time kind of understanding how a puzzle works. You're not being punished with having to do everything again. And this even goes into combat. There are specific combat situations where you'll have a certain amount of waves, and after you pass that one wave, you'll start on the next one, even if you die. So the best thing here about all this is that this is really intended for everybody. It's not just intended for those people that enjoy combat or puzzlers. Kids can play this, your grandmother can play this, and personally I think this is one of the best ways to start someone's VR experience, because the perspective here just offers so much in the way of comfort, where it's very hard for anyone to actually really become motion sick with a game like this. As we continue through the mire, we eventually end up at a temple where her uncle and the sprite champion sealed off the exit from the arcane while they were fleeing the castle. This is where the puzzles really start to use the arcane as pieces in each puzzle to help Quill traverse to exits. This is the first point of added difficulty, especially if you are out to collect all of the lost scrolls. This temple seems to be falling apart based on everything we're seeing, but it also seems to be very, very old. Entering one of the last rooms in the temple, there's a light drawing our attention to the left side of the room. Interacting with this light opens up a portal. I decide it's best to probably go and kind of clear everything out and enter that portal a little bit later. So going across the room and entering this last part of the temple, this is our first encounter with the Canon Arcane. These are pretty hard to deal with, at least at this point, and it took me a few tries to get a handle of it, but the next room shows us how we can use their cannons to unlock doors by shooting switches. And by the end of this temple, we get a key that will help us unlock the big door that we saw down the hallway prior to entering this part of the temple. Now, let's go back and see what that portal was. Once we enter the portal, we are in the realm of the sprites. This will look familiar as it's where we first met Quill, but instead of going to the village, there's a new area with trials to the left. These trials are to test and see if we are ready and can handle the road ahead of us. The toad from the mire exits a cave and tells us we are going to be tested, talking to someone who we can't hear or see. These trials are otherworldly, with floating platforms and what feels like magic. The voice that is heard seems to be the fallen sprite champion, but we won't know that until the third trial. At the end of this trial, we are given a new gauntlet, one that lets us see invisible platforms in these trial areas. These powers unfortunately don't come into our world, but they do make Quill a little bit stronger towards the melee arcane. Once we exit the trial, the toad has not really changed their mind on if we are ready or if we are essentially wasting their time, and they still think that we're not fit for the position of holding the glass. Exiting the portal, we're back in the temple and make our way towards the door, lighting the torches and placing the key, unlocking it. This is where we enter the last arena of the temple, where it throws everything that we've seen so far at us. This fight, while not as tough as some of the others that we've dealt with, was visually and mechanically pleasing and probably one of the best fights outside of one particular one where we fight a boss. Leaving this final arena, we enter the Cavern River, taking a boat to the bank where we meet the Starthing again. We finally get to see who they are, and they tell us their name is Adurin. It seems that we are not the only one who needs help. The bank here is another one of those places that has sound full of life. You can also see Quill's footprints as she walks across the stand. This little tiny detail is just another one of those things that Polyarc thought about to add to the game, and I absolutely love it. We're also able to see the castle in the distance. Before we head there, we need to perform another trial in the sprite realm. The toad still does not care for us and even considers us for lunch if we fail. Entering the trial, we are given a sword, and this sword allows us to shoot energy like we would from a cannon arcane. This will allow us to damage opponents and activate switches from a distance without needing to actually control an arcane or have an arcane within the puzzle to actually use those switches. We will need to charge it after every use, and this upgrade will also allow puzzles to become even more complex. And Polyarc doesn't hold back after this upgrade. Even after we complete this trial, the toad doesn't seem to think any different of us, and we are told to leave the sprite realm. Once we exit the portal and we climb up, we enter a hole in the wall to a cave where we're introduced to the last enemy we're able to fight directly. These are the ones that will explode if you get too close to them, and for me, this was a little bit difficult because I didn't really understand the mechanic, but after 2 or 3 tries, I understood that as soon as the timer starts, just hit them and you're pretty much good to go. Alone, they're really not that hard to deal with, but once you combine them with other enemies, that's when they become a much bigger issue. You can also use these to blow up walls as well as activate switches, which will come in handy on some of the puzzles that we will encounter throughout this cave. Once we get a handle on how these enemies work, we make it out of the cave and arrive at the city walls that our people fled from all those years ago. We enter the gate and are welcomed by one of the many sentries that keep watch over this place. These enemies are a one-hit kill, so you will need to make sure that you solve the puzzle before you even attempt to continue. Even if they're not looking at you, they will know exactly where you are even if you try and sneak past them when they're turned around. I'm not saying that these enemies are fair, but I think personally, if you could just sneak, they would probably not be as much of a threat as they are, and it probably would cause a lot of people not to really solve the entire puzzle, opting more or less to just sneak around rather than use some semblance of brain power to hit the few bits and bobs that you need to for these enemies. Once we enter the city square, it seems as though there's something we need to unlock before we are able to continue. For now, the only thing we can do is go up the stairs, where a Durin is waiting for us and informs us that the Master Sentry is activated and there's no other way to get through other than disabling it. A Durin opens up the previously closed gates at the bottom of the stairs, and once we enter, there is our last portal containing our last trial. Entering the portal for the last time, we make our way to the Toad, and it seems as though they think maybe we can do it. They open up the last trial, and this one here is probably the hardest. This is the part of the game that really reminded me of Crash Bandicoot. This battle against this creature here was just much harder than I could have imagined, and for me personally, I think that this was probably one of the most enjoyable fights, even if it was the hardest. And I wish that they had more in this game of fights like this, and that's neither here nor there. I do think, and I really do hope, that by the time I play Moss 2, they kind of learned and used fights like this a lot more in that game, but we will see whenever that review happens. Beating the boss, the Sprite Champion appears in front of us, bows, and then disappears. We still don't know how Veda feels about all this, but we can't think about that now, as we still need to rescue our uncle. Exiting the portal and solving the puzzle, we get our first piece which will help us shut down the Master Sentry. And once we return to the courtyard and insert the key, we head towards the other door, completing one more puzzle and getting the last key we need to return to be able to shut down the Master Sentry. Whenever I was actually going back through some of this footage, the big thing here that threw me off is I didn't even talk about this tavern. I don't know why I didn't, but here it is. This tavern here is probably one of, if not my personal favorite environment. I don't know what it is about the ambiance or just the feel and the look, but this tavern, I wish I saw it before the story of Moss happened. This is something that I want to see with activity. It just had that home feeling. I don't know what it is, but I really just wanted to make sure that I pointed this out because it took me like a good 10 minutes to get out of this one small location, all because of the small details. For anybody that doesn't want to hear the end of the game, go ahead and skip to this timestamp. This will give you my full conclusion and essentially get you to the end of the video without the end of story spoilers. Once the Master Sentry shut down, we try and enter the castle through the front door, only to be stopped and confronted by another arena of enemies. Getting to the end of this arena, the Master Sentry wakes back up and we're forced to drop through a trapdoor in the floor. This trapdoor leads to some sort of pit. It is dark, and we end up near a body. This seems to be Sarfog's pit, or maybe the castle dungeon. As we continue, we eventually get to a point where we enter the main chamber where Sarfog is. Sarfog attempts to come after us, but Adurin sacrifices himself to let us escape. This starts a multi-stage boss battle across many different arenas. We need to shoot Sarfog with a crossbow as we traverse and avoid his strikes. Some of these stages, all we can do is run, and others, we need to interact with the environment to be able to actually damage Sarfog. This entire segment is essentially a mix between precision and speed running until we're finally able to enter the castle's front gate, closing it and impaling Sarfog. We think we've defeated him, only for him to play dead and come back attempting to strike Quill, where she then leaps, finding a hole in his armor and killing him once and for all. Finally entering the castle, the music and the interior design bring home the reunion of Quill and her uncle. But Sarfog's not the only enemy in this castle. We need to find the King's Glass if we ever hope to return to our homeland again. This ends Book 1 of the Moss series. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. If you want to go just a little further, consider becoming a member and help make it possible for me to get more content like this out quicker. I had a very rough time feeling like I did this game justice. I think puzzle games for me are some of the hardest to review, Moss even more so. I think Moss is a game that is more than just its puzzles. Interaction with the main character is really where I feel this game stands apart from others. Yes, there are puzzles, but Quill is the real reason that kept me coming back. If you're someone who is new to VR as a whole, or even a veteran, I consider Moss to be on the must-play list for the medium. All thanks to Quill. And honestly, I think this entire review could have been just an analysis on how Moss offers one of the most believable characters in VR. Who knows, maybe after I play Moss Book 2, I can make that video. But in the meantime, if you like cute characters, puzzles, and bedtime stories, Moss will give you all of that and more. Finally, to the team at Polyarc, I want to thank you for bringing such a unique experience into the world of VR, and I can't wait to see what else is in store from the team in the future. I'm Butters with an O, and I want to once again thank you for letting me make my reality part of your virtual reality. See you next time.